My conversation today is with scholar, translator, historian, and mastermind behind the Modern Hermeticist YouTube channel, Dr. Dan Attrell. An accomplished academic, Dr. Attrell has compiled a veritable library for modern practitioners and scholars in esotericism, philosophy, occultism, and magic on his Modern Hermeticist channel, with his audiobook readings, commentary, lecture-style presentations, and conversations with other scholars. His has been a guiding voice for many over the past decade, including myself. We sat down to talk about his path to the academic study of esotericism, psychedelia, perrenialism versus convergent evolution, the 16th century Franciscan Archangelo of Borgonovo, returning to our heavenly source, and much more. I'm Ike Baker, and this is the Arcanum Podcast. It's a big day for the podcast. I've got Dr. Dan Attrell with me today. Back when the internet was somewhat of a wasteland, well, maybe let's say a different kind of wasteland for esotericism, the Modern Hermeticist was something I was listening to, daily, and content was going up. It still is coming up continuously, daily. And so huge influence, not only on this podcast, but on my trajectory as a practitioner, and encouraging me to investigate more of the academic stuff. Thank you so much for being here.
Hey, thanks, Ike. That's a great honor to be here. You've got a real illustrious line of guests on this podcast, so I'm very happy to be in among their ranks, so to speak. So thanks for having me.
Absolutely. And as an academic, I consider you among their ranks, implicitly. Um, so, you definitely have one of the most visible presences, I would say, if not, people knowing you by face, but definitely knowing you by voice, by your channel, and things like that. But there is a part of me that wonders if this may be an introduction to some of my listeners today. So I wanted to start off kind of back to basics. You've talked a little bit on other shows about, your beginning to take these things seriously, whatnot. But how did you first discover this stuff? How did you stumble upon esotericism?
That's a good question. I suppose I've always been interested in religion. So I grew up in a religious household. I still consider myself a religious practitioner. Um, and so that was definitely an in. You grow up reading the Bible, you grow up reading stuff about the worlds in between and the hidden world of angels and all of this stuff. This was very much part of my upbringing. I grew up with stories, for example. There's a story that in ancient Greece, you're supposed, well, maybe not a story, but an idea in ancient Greece that you're supposed to welcome in strangers because they could potentially be gods in disguise. Well, I grew up very much with the same kind of ideas in our household, except they were angels, of course. So never turn down a stranger because they could potentially be angels in disguise. And so that gives you a kind of little window into the kind of household that I grew up in. And so there was always that. Another big part for me, at least getting into esotericism, was music. And probably a lot of people have that exposure as well through music. So I was always a big fan of heavy metal music from the time I was maybe 13 years old. And that gave me a window into some of the more occult topics. And so I really wanted to understand what a lot of this poetry was about, what the symbolism was. And so I started digging into it and looking into it. And that had all kinds of different trajectories that I followed. So there was that. And then once I got probably around maybe the age of 18, 19, 20, I started being exposed to the ideas of figures like Terence McKenna, for example, and the whole world of psychedelia. And that took this world that was hidden and only discussed in dusty old tomes and alluded to obliquely and kind of ripped that veil right off. And it was then that I saw that the world that we inhabit is far more complicated, far more complex than I ever could have imagined, and certainly more complex than I can put into words. But something that I wanted to do was explore more of that world, but from within the context of history. When I was younger, I got really also into conspiracy theories and, all of that stuff. And so I wanted to make heads or tails of what that world was. What did I think was legitimate? What did I think were the ravings of madmen? And kind of come to terms with the different ideas one by one. And so I started doing some of that. And so it was at this kind of intersection of religion and music or art and psychedelia and what else? Like history and conspirituality, if you will, all kind of swirling together in a great mass. And I wanted to make sense of that big mess. And so that's why I started my YouTube channel, which was basically just grabbing some old dusty books off my shelf behind me and looking in a kind of chronological way uh, at the history of the world and trying to make sense of it from within a kind of not an objective historian kind of academic approach, but more of a, what is the qualia of history? And I know you're not supposed to do that as a historian. And so I have these kind of firm distinctions between what is my academic historical work and then what is a kind of more feely, raw approach to the sense of history or the feeling of history. And so I tried to explore those avenues, and that's what prompted the birth of the channel. Another big influence was, as I mentioned, Terence McKenna had a series of lectures when he was big into the psychedelia stuff in the 80s and the early 90s. And then eventually he had an experience that really shook him out of that. And he thought, everything I've been teaching and talking about is a lie or is somehow I'm selling stuff like the time wave and all of these different ideas that don't hold much water. Uh, and so he started to shift his point of view more towards Hermeticism. So he got really into the work of Francis Yates and was very big into the book Giordano Bruno and the Hermetic Tradition, and the Rosicrucian Enlightenment and these kinds of books. And so uh, Dame Francis Yates really was his window into that world. And he put out a call to people in his talks that, this is a kind of psychedelic thing all on its own without having to do any kind of drugs or consume anything. You can be exposed to the subconscious by looking at this world. And so he was really into Jung and all that sort of thing. And so I took that up and I thought, wow, like this stuff really is interesting. And what is what is the secret behind the alchemical language, behind the philosophical treatises, behind ritual magic and so forth. So I took up that call and started to explore that avenue. And in doing so, I came across the work of all kinds of other thinkers, people like Wouter Hanegraaff, for example, who took kind of this radical historicist approach to the topic. Not necessarily viewing it through the lens of New Age or anything like that, but trying to understand it on its own terms from within its historical context. And that's when I became really interested in that stuff. And once I got into university, I started to study the languages. And that really is my main in. I consider myself, first and foremost, a language guy, primarily Latin and Latin literature, medieval Latin literature. And so all of my formal training is in the language stuff. And I use that training not necessarily to go and read more about Caesar and Virgil and Lucan. And although I did read all that stuff in school, I wanted to look at the medieval stuff, particularly the magical stuff. And that's when I met David Pareca, who became my mentor and my teacher, not only in Latin stuff, but he was also big into the history of Hermeticism and magic. And so uh, I went down that road with him, and he had been working on a version of the Picatrix. He had been translating that for some time from the Latin, and so he hired me on board to kind of join and in with him and to turn it into a publishable thing. And we worked on it for like 6 years. And then finally we got it published in I think 2019. Time has kind of all bleeds together now post COVID. It's hard to remember the events of my own life very clearly, but and then from that point on, I got into Ficino and started working on Ficino and Pico, and I did my doctoral work on those figures. And then what I found in that too was that there was a lot of stuff that was overwrought, I found. Like in Frances Yates, she had created all these narratives about Ficino the magician and Pico della Mirandola the magician. And when I started looking into it, I found, yes, Ficino certainly was an astral magician, but he was also a Catholic priest. And that looms much larger in his life than being a magus, which is what a lot of people in the Anglosphere know him as. And so a lot of my work was focusing on that aspect of him. And then in terms of Pico, there was no magic at all. He's not a magician. He's not a practitioner. He has magical theses, like in his Orphic theses and things like that. But he's pretty clear in his writings that he himself does not practice magic. He practices a kind of mystical, if you want to call it theurgy, we might be able to call that, but it's a mystical ascent of the annihilation of the self in God. And Kabbalah was his main in for that. And so I started to do a lot of research on that. And I would say that as far as being a practitioner, I would cleave more closely to the school of Pico and what Pico is doing, which is this attempt to annihilate the self in God, in the one, more or less. That is my practice. And it's an intellectual practice. It's not really a magical practice in the sense of um, manipulating different substances, material, animal, vegetable, mineral, what have you, in order to acquire things or get results here on Earth. It's more of like a long-term spiritual, mystical practice. And so that is more so what I am a practitioner of. But then when I went into you start looking at the Corpus Hermeticum and things like that, you start to realize that there isn't a lot of magic there outside of the practical Hermetica, and it is more of a purificatory, um, propitiating the gods, bringing the gods down from the heavens to dwell among mankind, and creating a kind of feedback loop of kind of self-recognition between the self and the divine. So God makes man, and then man makes these gods and populates the world with gods, and so that sort of thing became much more attractive to me, and I would say that makes up most of my practice. But again, it's within a Christian context rather than a pagan context, and that might surprise a lot of people, but a lot of the earliest Hermeticists, the people who called themselves Hermeticists first, were often Christians, guys like Ludovico Lazzarelli, for example. So that really is my point of view. And it's changed a lot over the years. I was a lot into thelema as well in my early 20s, and that was a big part of me kind of finding myself. And I realized that maybe it's through a misunderstanding of thelema or something, but much of what I was looking for in thelema already existed in the philosophy of Augustine to a certain part, and that there was a kind of emphasis on love, on the love of the divine, the love of neighbors, on compassion, on these sorts of things. And so that really spoke to me. And I've kind of moved a little bit away from the Crowley stuff. I still am interested in it as a kind of historical phenomenon, but I wouldn't consider myself a Thelemite necessarily, though I do certainly have libertarian leanings. Uh, it's just, what are you going to do with that freedom? Are you going to use it to throw yourself into want and abandon, or are you going to use it to build yourself up, build up your neighbors, create value for the world, that sort of thing? So that became more my emphasis. And lately, I've been more so teaching.
Mm.
So I've been working at the University of Waterloo, working at the University of McMaster University, and I've been teaching Roman religion, which is a great passion of mine, the Greek and Roman religion. And also, I taught a course on heresies, which you can actually find on my Patreon if you're interested in surveying that course. And I also teach Introduction to Medieval Studies. So basically, how do we know what we know about the Middle Ages? So there are units on numismatics and units on literature and units on history and all the different subfields of medieval studies. So that's kind of what I've been focusing a lot of my attention on. And lately, I've been doing a lot of translation work, which is also an important part of my labors. So right now I'm working on a 16th century Franciscan called Archangelo of Borgonovo. And he is a friar who wanted to defend Pico della Mirandola's conclusions. So Pico's conclusions, as soon as he wrote them, the Pope basically had a council assemble and examine all of his conclusions, and they decided that a number of them were heretical. And so what Arcangelo does is he comes along and he defends Pico against these Dominican attacks, these Dominican friars. He himself is a Franciscan, and he's trying to show, like, no, actually, these are pretty orthodox ideas. And if you only understand them correctly, you'll see that there's nothing wrong with them. And so he comments on Pico's theses, which are these short little statements that are very nebulous. He doesn't ever explain them. We don't have his explanations for them. But Arcangelo wrote hundreds and hundreds of pages of commentary on these little ideas. And so in the wake of my dissertation, I feel like I'm well situated to do that work because it's blending Hermeticism and Kabbalah and blending Neoplatonic philosophy and also the kind of spirituality of the Franciscan order and kind of blending all that stuff together in a way that is irresistible to me. And so that's what I'm working on right now. And I've got a number of other projects in the pipeline, but I don't need to talk about those right now. So that's what I'm doing right now is focusing a lot of attention on Latin translation stuff.
That's fantastic. That's fascinating, actually. Looking forward to seeing how that develops. That whole sort of history of Arcangelo and his defenses there. That sounds really cool. I want to dial in a little bit on specifically Hermeticism for a moment.
Hmm.
So, right, the modern Hermeticist. I'm wondering, aside from the mere passage of time, what does modern Hermeticism look like in your estimation? Are there definitive aspects of and to a modern Hermeticist?
Right. So I feel like the modern hermeticist is kind of like a misnomer in a way because first off, I should say that when I came up with that name, I was thinking of it more like a newspaper or something like that. Not me necessarily. Like it wasn't so much that I am the modern hermeticist, it's that the channel is that, and there would be all kinds of different material associated with that. And I think over the last decade or so, especially with the Kabbalion wars and all that, people have gotten a lot more focused in on what they mean by Hermeticism. But when I came up with that title back in whatever it was, 2014 or something like that, uh, I was using it very loosely, sort of in the same way that Francis Yates was using it in the Hermetic tradition. It's more of a catch-all term for esotericism. So sometimes people will watch the content and say, oh, this is not Hermeticism, or this or that is not Hermeticism. And that's fair. Dionysius the Areopagite is not Hermeticism, at least not in this kind of strict sense of the term, but in the more expansive sense of the term that it's been used historically, it is more just a catch-all for esotericism. Things that are hidden, things that are sealed away, things that are not spoken about in an open forum, that are often directed to the initiates, and if you will. And so that is what I kind of meant when I was using that term, the modern hermeticist. Um, but what does it mean to be a modern hermeticist? I think that it is somebody who blends, at least in my case, technology and and the kind of multimedia approach to an old topic. Someone who's using these new mediums of communication to shed light on something that's been around for a long time. And so that is more so what it means. But it doesn't mean um, using necessarily like chaos magic or something, these more modern forms of magic. I am more traditional in my approach. And in my opinion, Hermeticism is a lot about simple piety. It's about breaking bread with friends. It's about, there's more of a kind of Pythagorean angle to it. It's more about ritual purity and being in communion with the gods in what way that in whatever way that might be to you, depending on whether you're a polytheist or a monotheist or some combination of both. I think that there's room in Hermeticism for both of those things because the Corpus Hermeticum is not perfectly clear on that question. It has different answers depending on which tractate you're looking at. And so that leaves some wiggle room in that regard. Of course, there are people who look at the Corpus Hermeticum as a kind of initiatory pathway. Um, and so, from a kind of world denying to a world affirming uh, approach. But you could argue the other way around as well, that you move from a world affirming to a world denying approach. So the verdict is not like the judgment is not out on that question. And so I think it's important to explore a lot of these contradictions and surf through these paradoxes. And so I think that's what a lot of the work that I do is doing. It's not trying to settle on a definitive um, image of what Hermeticism is, but more to see that throughout history, there's been all kinds of things attributed to Hermes Trismegistus, and they range, of course, from the practical Hermetica to the theoretical Hermetica. You've got your magic, your mysticism, you've got your polytheism, you've got your monotheism, you've got your more Platonic kind of philosophy. So there's a big range of stuff. And that's what I wanted to encapsulate with the channel, was to not to settle on a kind of this is the doctrine, this is the dogma, and so on and so forth, but to show all the different people throughout history that have looked at this current and explored it. So
Yeah, and I think it's particularly appropriate, using technologies for communication, mass communication, long distance communication, right? Very mercurial, very, Hermian Uh, and I agree with you because when you really look at, first of all, I watched the video that you made a couple years ago on the Kabbalion, whether or not it's hermetic, and I was terrifically relieved that somebody was deciding to have that conversation. But I, looking at that whole era, right? The 19th century, late 19th century, early 20th century sort of, I don't know if I can call it a hermetic revival or something. You've got people like Juliana Kremers, and you've got later on or early mid 20th century. You've got Barden. You've got the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, and these people were all kind of doing exactly what you're talking about, where they're bringing in all of this tradition because I think what they're trying to hone in on is a collection of traditions which they all kind of feel are related phenomenologically because they were very interested in the practice of this stuff. So I see a through line really between those people and what you're doing and what other scholars and scholarly practitioners are doing. I definitely see that there is not only an authenticity but an evolution of it, right? Which I think also it can correspond to a deity like Hermes Mercurius or something like that. So that is that through that passage of time. But one thing that I find a lot of people obsessing on, and I want to get your take on this, right? I watched your last video, which was you reading as an audiobook Franz Kumon's Astrology and Religion Among the Greeks and Romans. By the way, for anybody that hasn't listened to Dan's audiobooks, the reading of these ancient texts and things like that in English, superb quality. It's fantastic, and there's no really there's some video, right? Like you can read along, but you can listen to it in the car as well, which I do that when I have to drive. But it was interesting because the book opens up, right, and he's talking about how when they found the Dendara zodiac, they attributed initially to like pre-pharaonic antiquity, and then found out it was really like, well, Hellenistic Roman really era. I even to this day I see a lot of that sort of over prioritization of something being ancient, right? Like some people will recklessly ascribe an antiquity when there is none, and others are kind of like, oh, this isn't old enough, I'm going to throw it out. So what do you think motivates us to constantly be on that hunt?
I think we've inherited that from the ancients. So clearly the Greeks and the Romans, they looked at the world around them and they saw that there were places that were much older than them. They looked at the pyramids and they thought like these buildings have been here for far longer than we have been. The Greeks, the Romans, we are a young people. And the Romans as well, when they looked at the Greeks, they thought the same thing. And if they thought we have a lot to learn from people who lived in antiquity relative to their time, and that's tied in with ideas of ancestor worship, if they were your own ancestors, but of just venerating that which is ancient. This is why Jews, for example, were given special rights or privileges within the Roman Empire that Christians were not given, because the Romans recognized that the Jews were a very ancient people. They were practicing the mos maiorum, the way of their ancestors. And so for that reason, they got a kind of permission to deny all of the other gods and only worship one god, because they thought, these people have been doing this forever. Whereas what the Christians are doing, that's a very new thing. And so there is this idea that we get from the Greeks and Romans that older is better, and that if something is not old, if something is new, then it's suspect in a certain way. And I, yeah, I lean towards the idea more that things are a lot newer than older, or like that I put more emphasis and stress on the new, and we can put new in brackets because new can be within the last 2000 years or something like that. And less emphasis on what is very, very, very old, because we can go and look at that stuff. We still have the Book of the Dead, for example. But then when you look at the Book of the Dead and you compare that with the Corpus Hermeticum, they're clearly very different things. There may be some overlap. There may be, people often think of Akhenaten and the monotheism of Akhenaten and the ripple effect that that had, but I'm not so sure about that. It's too easy to me to make a connection between the solar monotheism of Akhenaten and the monotheism of Judaism, and to say that they're just one and the same, or that one was clearly influenced by the other. So yeah, I do stress the new, I think, or I don't really privilege something just because it's old. And so in that sense, what was fascinating about the Kumon book, and one of the big takeaways from that book, and one of the reasons why I loved it, and I read it as an undergraduate, and that's why I thought I should read this book again, is the idea that astrology is relatively new because astrology requires data. You have to have data that tabulates the correspondences and the correlations between celestial and terrestrial events. It's not just putting up stones and making calendars and things like that that track the movements of the planets. That we could call astronomy if we want to force a dichotomy between astrology and astronomy, which I wouldn't necessarily. But in terms of understanding the correlations between celestial and terrestrial events, I think that's a relatively recent phenomenon. And so Kumon was one of the first people to really come out and say that. And so I really respect him for that. He was wrong about a lot of other things, like in Mithraism and that sort of thing. He thought, for example, Mithraism was linked to the Mitra in the Vedas and was really a Persian cult that had been imported into Rome. But really, it is more of a new religious movement in Rome that has the window dressing or the trappings of an ancient Persian religion. And there may be some elements of that, but by and large, it follows more so the other mystery cults in its content. And it was influenced by things like Chaldean astrology. And again, most of those things were relatively new. They were not from 1200, 1400 BC. They were more from 300 BC, around that time. So, uh, yeah, I think there's a people like to stress the antiquity of things as a kind of trump card to say like, well, my tradition is more ancient and more venerable and therefore more valuable. But I like to say that innovation has its place in the world,
Yeah.
and that people do discover things that are new.
Yeah.
There is sometimes new things under the sun. There was a time when there were no cameras, and now there are cameras. And so to say that there were always cameras is not true. So people make discoveries, they tabulate new data, they uncover new things. And I think that we as a species don't necessarily always need to look back. We do need to have some sense of the past, but we also learn a lot as we go throughout history, and our context informs us.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think a lot of what's happening now just in the world is this competition for like, primacy in terms of, oh, well, your tradition is derivative, or your tradition has co-opted mine,
Hmm.
or built something, when in reality I see it as evolutions. That would be like blaming me for having my parents' genetics in some sense, but disillusionment is a rite of passage for scholars and practitioners alike. I think you just got to get through that, right? I mean, you talk a little bit about Platonic Orientalism, particularly in the introduction you wrote for the translation of Pingree's Latin Picatrix you were talking about earlier. So, you know, then there's this whole introduction to the idea of a Prisca Theologia, right? Or a perennial philosophy. I mean, how much credence do you give to the possibility that, this what's happening now, or the newer stuff, in at least in terms of religio-philosophical developments and explorations, is us kind of picking up the thread or rediscovering what was already there, and taking the ball another 20 yards down the field.
Yeah, this is a huge can of worms, and I've spoken for hours and hours and hours about this. So I won't get too much into it, but I am more of like a convergent evolutionist than I am a perennialist. And so convergent evolution, if you don't know, is this idea from biology that uh, two different species can develop, let's say, a claw or a wing. They don't necessarily have to come from the same tradition. They encounter a similar environment and they adapt and evolve into having similar organs for doing similar purposes, but that doesn't necessarily mean that there is a kind of genetic link between them. And so I'm more of this idea into this idea of convergent evolution when it comes to that stuff. There are some ideas that are perennial for sure, but I also see within perennialism there are ideas that are holdovers from Hellenistic imperialism. And so Hellenistic imperialism, you have the rulers of the Hellenic kingdoms who come in the wake of Alexander's conquests. They're trying to bind together these huge territories under one culture, one kind of oikumene. They all speak Koine Greek, and we're looking for ideas in common that can bind all of these complex theologies of people like the Thracians, the Indians, the Egyptians, the Syrians, and so forth, and to come up with something that binds them all together. And the reason why you do that is because it makes people easier to rule. There is a huge part of perennialism that is inextricably wound up with imperialism and the need to control the narrative, if you will. And now I'm not going to say that all people who practice perennialism or whatever are by definition imperialists, but that is a kind of a root of that concept, and it does play out throughout history. It makes its way into Christianity, for example, with the idea of the pre-incarnate logos, that Christ was always in existence because he is the second part of the Trinity. He is the Son, but the Son is eternal, is co-eternal with the Father, and so always existed even before he had incarnated. And there are all kinds of pre-Christological theophanies throughout history, like Melchizedek, for example. Um, and so this idea then gets taken up by a lot of philosophers in the Renaissance, guys like Ficino and Pico, who see the links between Platonic philosophy and Christian theology and try to see them as one kind of unbroken link from Zoroaster or from Moses, depending on who you ask, down through Hermes Trismegistus, down through Aglaophemus and Orpheus and Pythagoras, and then finally articulated in the philosophy of Plato. And again, there are some ideas that clearly are held in common between all of these different groups. The immortality of the soul is often the idea that is most touted as being in common between them. And so for guys like Ficino and for Pico, they ask themselves, okay, if we all have this immortal spark within us, this um, irreducible unit of individuality that is made in the image of God and that is eternal, uh, what happens then when we die? Either we go to be with God or we are cast into the outer darkness. And so, how do we get good with God, essentially? And if you're a Christian, then that will be through the person of Jesus, through the incarnation. If you're a Catholic, of course, you will also have the sacraments. So you have a theurgical dimension through the church. And then, but if you're a pagan or a polytheist or Platonist, then it's more about ritual purity and about communing with the gods and about doing the kinds of activities that we see laid out in, let's say, the Asclepius or the Corpus Hermeticum, the philosophy of Iamblichus or Porphyry. Uh, and so it's more about saving yourself, if you will, rather than being saved by God. But either way, there is a hope for salvation going on. And even this idea of salvation goes back to the Hellenistic kings. They were soter, they were saviors, and but they weren't saviors in a metaphysical kind of way. They were saviors in this world. They brought an end to war. They ensured that the grain dole kept flowing. They built aqueducts and brought water and fought off disease and pestilence. And they brought all of these benefices to people. And a god is what a god does. A god is someone who expresses power. And so in this is why you have ruler cults in antiquity and this idea that individual kings and rulers can be saviors. And it's not long until that idea starts to be extrapolated from these kind of this worldly saviors, which includes the Messiah of Judaism, of course, who is a savior of this world, a kind of political king. And that gets mapped onto this idea of salvation of the immortal soul. So these, you see how it's this kind of intermingling of the political and the metaphysical, the historical plays a big part of it. And there is truth lying in all of these different schools of thought. But it's important to, I think, in my opinion, look at each of these movements on their own terms, as kind of discrete movements in history that are formed by their context, and to see what's going on that made these people come up with these ideas in the same way that a biologist might look at different species of crustaceans and see how it is that they all developed claws in a certain way, even if they may not be related. I don't know if that's the best analogy, but hopefully that illustrates things a little bit.
Yeah. And I like the, identifying the really um, practical component, like you're saying, the theurgic aspects of Catholicism and the sacraments, and sort of this soteriology that is self-made. I mean, if you think about, right, what Iamblichus had to say, and on the mysteries, theurgy is divine action. So the gods save you, but in reality, you're doing stuff too. You're not just sitting there, right? That's kind of what is distinct about his theurgy. But I really enjoyed your mention in the introduction of the Picatrix. You said that, or you wrote that Al-Qurtubi, to whom the authorship of the Picatrix was sort of traditionally attributed, he I'm going to quote you here. Quote, magic is the inevitable consequence of a zealous philosophical life. So there's this kind of, uh, period that is a little bit maybe more intellectual and a little bit more discursive, but then the actual sort of practice of this. And I would say, looking at something like Perfect Nature, I would say that there is a theurgic component in that particular kind of magic, kind of similar almost to the Holy Guardian Angel or something like that. So I really, that quote really stuck with me because it started ringing bells the first time I read it. We're like, yeah, you start off in this sort of investigative mode that your mind starts opening, like you're talking about what was happening to you with the psychedelics and with the conspiracy theories. And you and I are very close in age, so I know exactly what you're talking about. For some reason, many of us, that was our own private little world that we lived in with with metal and surrealist art and stuff like that, sort of breaking us open. I see perennialism offering that, this idea of the perennial philosophy offering that to, you know, late 1800, late 19th century sort of that theosophical movement. It gets people excited to start discovering this stuff again. But part of me knows that the primary or the ultimate eventuality is some sort of practice. So I was really happy, to hear that you do have a practice, even though it's much more mystical. I can't remember if you said while we were rolling there you incorporate prayer into your practice, correct?
Right. Right. So, we were discussing this briefly before the show,
Right.
and so people will often wonder, am I a practitioner? Is often the question. And to that, I have to answer, well, practitioner of what? I'm certainly not a practitioner of everything just for the sake of being one. And so I would say that my practice, if you will, is more mystical than it is magical. Now, that said, I have a decent working knowledge of astrology. I've made some talismans, but that said, I am more focused on the interiority element of things, in which prayer is a cornerstone. And prayer is the key to theurgy as well. There are sacrifices and things like that are attendant on the prayer, but prayer really is one of the main aspects. I always say that theurgy is something like the intersection between art, prayer, and meditation, and bringing those things all together into one practice. And so, yeah, my practice is more so geared toward the intellectual, the mystical, the interior, and I'm not so much concerned with bringing together various elements, components of the material world, um, suffumigations and herbs and metals and things in order to achieve results down in this world. A lot of magicians, surely people even who have come on this show, they are very results oriented. So they say, does it work? Does it deliver results? And that's not necessarily my practice. My practice is more so related to the interior world where results are not tangible. So you can't really, like, only you can be the arbiter of whether you're getting results or not. It's not like I wished for the bicycle and I got the bicycle, or I didn't get the bicycle, so I must have done something wrong. I'm not asking God for bicycles. I'm asking for wisdom, for patience, for virtues, for these kinds of things, and also to as a kind of anagogical process towards eventually shuffling off this mortal coil and going to be in that world that I've visited many times, or what I assume is these worlds outside of our world. um I don't know what happens at the moment of death, but I'm going to hedge my bets, and I'm going to assume that it's not just the end, and that you're going to want to have the right passcodes, if you will. You're going to want to have uh, being a person who focuses on love and benevolence and things like that, if you want to be received by God with love and benevolence. And so that really is my approach. So a lot of people would just call that religion, and I'm fine with that. Um, and so, when people ask, are you a practitioner? It depends what you mean. I'm certainly a practitioner of philosophy, and I feel like in late antiquity, philosophy took on uh, a kind of magical turn, and magic took on a philosophical turn. And so those things bleed into one another. And arguably, what are the magi, if we want to go back to the etymology of the word? They're priests. They're Persian priests. They're religious people who do fire rituals to get good with Ahura Mazda, and have right speech and right action and right thoughts. And I think that more so informs me than trying to draw down the spirits to do things for me. And so, yeah, and I think that there's a world of angels, and that the angelic world very much is that divine world. So I'm of probably a very unpopular opinion that a lot of the gods, as we know them, are angels. And uh, some people deny that. They think they're ontologically different categories. But in my mind, the gods are angels, and we need to move up that hierarchy, up to the ultimate point, up to the ultimate pinnacle, because that's what the angels want us to do. Is they're always pointing upward. They're bringing messages down, and they're pointing us upward in a kind of anagogical ascent. And so, um, I do believe in a world populated by divinities, by gods. Certainly, the planetary gods are very interesting to me. I run a Twitter account where basically every day I put up a piece of art that is representative of a particular planetary god. And that is in large part to be part of this tradition and to show people for how long people have been interested in the planetary gods and in all gods for that matter. So, yeah, some people they won't like that because it's not true polytheism, and I'm okay with that. But that's kind of my school of thought is this more Christian Platonic approach to the divine world. I certainly do believe that there are many gods, but I only revere one above all of them. That's a commandment, right? To not have any other gods before God. That isn't to say that there aren't other gods, but it is to have one as the supreme God.
Right.
Uh, so, so that's kind of a window into my beliefs to some extent, as much as I have them pinned down because they're always in flux. I don't have a kind of secret doctrine that I'm trying to teach people, other than that things are within the context of the world, and that you can't just. I don't think that all of these things are dwell transcendentally outside of time and space, and that some people have access to it and some people don't. I think that our experience of what is transcendental is conditioned by our our conditions in history, and so that I think also is why I was attracted to Christianity, especially because it does try to bridge the transcendental and the material. There's a kind of a bringing down of the heavens into the material, and then in so doing, there's a kind of sacralization of the material world, and that turns us back up to the heavenly. And I see that also in things like the Asclepius with the kind of god making that is in there. It's a lot to do with a philosophy of images, and that we are made in the image of God, so we are like talismans of God, and we can also fashion images, and everything we do really is a projection of our own images. So the whole world is just these images, projecting images, all the way back to this original ground of being, if you will, which is above being and outside being. Uh, and so that is my philosophy, if you will, in a nutshell. But difficult to pin it down in a kind of systematic way rather than a discursive way.
Well, I mean, I think that's even of the discursive philosophers, I think it's part and parcel of practicing philosophy. Is like like caveat, all these things are subject to change in some way,
Yeah.
tweak maybe, but they will change. So as we wind down the conversation, which has been fantastic, I there's a couple of canned questions that I like to give people. One that I wanna posit to you is, you know, I was back there in 2015, 2016, listening to your channel, and I've watched it grow. I've watched your career change and develop. How have you seen things change since you began your studies, right? Because you didn't insulate yourself to just an academic world. You were out there, and people like me were listening and commenting, and there was this exchange. So, how have you seen things change the most starkly?
Um, Change in like the culture of esotericism, or like,
Sure. And, that could be practitioner, that could be within the academy. I was very surprised when I read about you back then. I was like, you can get a degree in what this guy has degrees in? Like,
sort of, yeah. If you do it through other channels, like if you do it through history or through classics and you focus on the languages, then you can definitely do it. Whether there will be jobs on the other side for you afterward is another thing. So I would advise people to think about that very carefully. You want to get good at a couple of practical things that you can teach if you want to delve into the realm of academic studies. But something I think a big change that I've seen for the better is more emphasis on sources, more emphasis on what do the actual texts say, and being critical about our sources. And so that change really possessed me and my channel, where I started to focus a lot on trying to dig up the sources and present them to people in a way that they might actually consume those sources. Because a lot of people they don't read. They just it's very time consuming. There's millions and millions of books. You're supposed to read all of them, and so where do you start? And so what I wanted to do was kind of, in reading some of these works, to make them available online in an easy to digest form that you can listen to while you're driving, like you say, or doing chores or before bed or something like that. Um, and be able to have access to that information, and not just kind of commentaries on the information, which I find a lot of internet stuff is that, and that's fine too. But I've tried to focus more on getting back to the sources and seeing what the sources say. And they're very different from what people expect sources to be. That digging sheds a light on things that, things are not as simple often as people represent them when you're doing a kind of secondary analysis. And so that's a big thing, is this return to the sources, this ad fontes approach. So I'm a big fan of that. What else have I seen? I mean, there's a lot of good content online for sure, and a lot of that has been paralleled in the academia with a lot of research being done on these texts. And you know, these kinds of studies were unthinkable in the 60s, when people were much more concerned with social history, with how history is moved by the economy, for example, or studying the little people doing their daily work and things like that, and studying economies and material culture. And that stuff's great, right? We need that stuff. But the idea that you would study magic was kind of unthinkable to people to do it seriously. People didn't want to do this intellectual history. They wanted to look in the ground and see things. There was a materialist emphasis. And I think that that pendulum has swung back, and we're looking again at ideas in a way that people didn't want to look so much at ideas in the 60s and the 50s. So that's great. And we'll see where that keeps going. We'll see. I assume there will be, the pendulum will swing back, and we'll start to look more at material culture in magic, for example, like more in-depth studies on that. Um, and then there's of course this kind of bifurcation between the practitioner and the scholar, which, we don't need to get too much into that, but I think that it's a false dichotomy for the most part. Most rigorous practitioners are quite scholarly in their research and in their approach, and most academics who are interested in this stuff, they have parts of their belief system that they aren't willing to put on paper, that they aren't willing to spill the beans about in case they get accused of not being serious thinkers or within academia or whatever. But I've never met, or very rarely have met, academics who focus on esotericism and magic and things like that, who don't believe in something or another, or perhaps are deep into the woods of psychedelics or what have you. So I think that that dichotomy is often too too stressed. And so I think probably that's another trend that I'm seeing is the collapsing of that dichotomy, that the practitioners are kind of tightening their game and they're becoming more in touch with the sources and source criticism and things like that. And the academics are being more interested in the interior landscapes of people rather than just what they wrote, what kind of material remains they left in the ground, and that sort of thing. So that's a trend that I think is positive, and I've seen over the last couple of years. There may be other trends like more political in nature, like the discourse is always changing politically in terms of what is fashionable,
Right.
what gets you grants. In academia, it's driven by grants and grant applications, and you never know who's going to be on the committee that's funding your project. And so people write proposals that talk up to the fashions. They say things that people want to hear in order to get that grant money, and so that's something that has to be factored in. So the winds of politics often colors the field, and I think the field also is pretty heavily bifurcated in political camps. There
Mm.
are, leftist occultists who will have nothing to do with right-wing occultists, and right-wing occultists who will have nothing to do with left-wing occultists, and the paganism stuff is all tied in with that, where you have left-wing pagans and right-wing pagans, and um, so that is something that I've seen more polarization, which I expected.
Yeah.
I don't see that going away anytime soon. Um, so that's another trend that I've seen, and there may be more, but I think those are some of the main trends that I've seen over the past couple of years
Mm.
is people getting more rigorous on both sides of the fence in terms of the scholarly practitioner divide, and then
Mm.
people becoming more politically polarized and divided into camps.
Mm. Yeah, well, that's brilliant. Thank you for sharing that. And then, of course, I've got my last question that everybody, or almost everybody, gets. Covered a lot of ground today. You can list your own works. You could even list some of the audio books that you've put up, but three books that you would recommend people that have listened to our conversation today check out.
So my three books are my translation of the Picatrix with David Parecka. We've also got a translation together of Marsilio Ficino's On the Christian Religion. And lately, I've also done a translation of Agrippa's lesser known Hermetic works with Justin Sledge. And so I would recommend checking that out. It's called Invisibilia Dei, and it's the lesser known Hermetic works uh, of Heinrich Cornelius Agrippa, though I will give a caveat that if you're not interested in Christian Hermeticism, skip it because it's almost all Christian, but it is almost all cobbled together from excerpts of the Corpus Hermeticum. So it's this window into how the Renaissance Hermeticists thought that they weren't really pagan revivalists necessarily. They were very deeply mystical thinkers who were tapping into what they saw as a kind of philosophia perennis or a more of a perennial Platonic philosophical tradition. Um, but again, like it gets complicated because they thought that the Platonists ripped off the Christians and not vice versa.
Yeah.
And so you'll still get people arguing about this. Like, is Dionysius the Areopagite really the follower of Paul? And then all of these, like Plotinus and Proclus and these guys are ripping him off? or is it the other way around? I'm more partial to the idea that Dionysius is a late figure, and you know, Proclus's fingerprints are all over it.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
so I see them as intertwined, really, and in the Renaissance that intertwinement was made complete, and it was congealed in a kind of form of Renaissance esotericism, that you can go and read all about in all kinds of different books. I suppose the other thing that I'm working on right now is I just started a new podcast which is in Latin only. Um, and so it's a pedagogical tool, and it really is intended. There's a lot of great content on YouTube for what's called comprehensible input. The idea is that people don't really learn languages very well from just reading grammar books and copying out paradigms and things. They need to have a good amount of input, a high volume of stuff. And so what I wanted to do was do a contribution to that quantity of material, but that was geared towards magic, esotericism, reading the Renaissance philosophers, reading the grimoires of the Middle Ages, and so it's more thematic in that sense. And less focusing on Virgil and Caesar and classical Latin, and more geared towards the Latin of the books that we all know and love. And so I'm doing that right now. So if you're interested in learning Latin or bolstering your Latin, being exposed to more of it, I recommend checking that out as well. It's called De Arte et Mysteriis. So, on art and the mysteries. And it's all about alchemy, Kabbalah, and astrology, and these kinds of different things.
That's incredible. That's awesome. I'm gonna check that out. I'm also I've got your I've got that translation here, the Agrippan stuff pulled up. I'm gonna definitely that's gonna be my reading for next month. But I thank you so much for coming on, Dr. Dan Attrell. I'm looking forward to everything that you've got going in the future. We all are, and it's been an honor to talk to you today. Thank you for being with me.
Well, thank you very much. It was my pleasure. Time just flew by. I mean, I felt like we didn't cover any ground at all, but at the same time, we covered a lot of ground. So happy to come back as well.
Absolutely.
And it's been a great chat. So thanks for having me on.